In this story, an ambitious and courageous knight is destined to die on the battlefield. He once believed that someone like him, whose talents awakened, flourished, and took root in war, could start a new life. In that new life, he imagined he could finally have a family, something he desperately longed for. Unfortunately for him, it was nothing more than an impossible dream. The knight kneeling before us is none other than the famous Agrick of the Drenic Empire, the protagonist of our tale. His final opponent is another great knight named Duke Termion, one of the 6 Exa-class knights of the Ultion Empire. Even Agrick understands the weight of this challenge, especially after feeling the crushing pressure of the black aura that engulfed the battlefield after just a single day. Duke Termion finds it fascinating that Agrick remains steadfast, even knowing he faces one of the 6 Exa-class knights. He even laments that it is a shame to end the life of such a brilliant talent. But Agrick is far from surrendering. He rises to his feet, swings his sword defiantly, and declares that he was born on the battlefield, and there he will die. The two warriors begin to walk toward each other, their sheer auras throwing the area into chaos. The Duke points out that although Agrick is brave, there is still a trace of regret in his eyes. Termion continues, saying that Agrick could have been a formidable rival in the future. Then he charges his sword with energy and rushes at our hero, expressing hope that when Agrick gains a new life, he can let go of his regrets. With that, the Duke swings his blade. Before he draws his last breath, Agrick reflects on the war between the Drenic Empire and the Ultion Empire, which has lasted for many years. His mother was a victim of that war. He had been just a newborn when she died in the surrounding chaos, leaving him alone in this tumultuous world as an orphan. While other children played with toys and read books, he struggled to contribute to the war and fight for his kingdom. At 14, he was forced to take up a sword and was sent to his first battlefield. He fought bravely, and in that moment his talents awakened. The manhua in his heart amplified his movements and senses to levels he had never imagined. He began to rise through the ranks of the knights and amazed everyone by taming 3 manhwas, becoming a quad-core warrior with 4 cores. His dream of joining the 5 extra-class knights of the empire was finally within reach. He believed that this final war might bring peace to his weary life. So he fought his last battle valiantly, thinking he was on the verge of achieving everything he had ever wanted, until Duke Termion arrived. The Duke's mere presence caused everyone to scatter. Back in the present, the Duke's first strike shatters Agrick's sword into pieces, and his dream disintegrates before his eyes. The Duke's next blow pierces his heart. Agrick reflects that all he ever wanted was to create a family, but that hope is lost. The stab hurls him across the battlefield, and he crashes hard to the ground. The impact splits the earth around him as he slides, bloodied and broken. As he begins to lose consciousness, everything fades into complete darkness. But the veil of darkness lifts as he opens his eyes. The first thing he sees is a couple trying to play with him, or rather trying to play with their child. Agrick quickly grows impatient as he hears them calling him their son. His father lifts him up with a wide smile and calls him Dame, telling him he must become a fantastic swordsman and follow in his father's footsteps. His mother, named Dane Sogress, quickly snatches him from her husband's arms, insisting that Dane will become an extraordinary assassin instead. Her energetic husband, Dane Sogress, and his wife argue over which career their son should pursue, while Dane feels shy and confused by their debate. Apparently they are traveling by carriage toward their home, and the discussion continues the entire trip. Lily believes that infiltrating the shadows to assassinate targets and escaping unseen is far more exciting, while the father insists that the spear is the most beautiful and complete martial art. Such is the life of our hero. Just when he thought he was lost on that battlefield, he miraculously finds himself reincarnated. The twist in his story is that he is now in the Ultion Empire. His former enemy is the youngest son of a certain count. When the carriage finally stops at the mansion grounds, his parents reach a compromise and decide they will teach him both skills, but Lily still does not give up, stubbornly declaring that her son will become an assassin, while Arkan merely laughs, insisting that Dane will be a lancer. The carriage driver nods to signal their arrival, and both parents pause their debate for the moment. Confused that they had already arrived, the couple realized they must have lost track of time while arguing. The husband quickly stepped out of the carriage and offered his hand to help his wife down. She felt a little embarrassed and asked what the castle staff might think if they saw them. He laughed softly and said he only wanted to hold his wife's hand. Why should that matter? With that, he guided his beautiful wife out of the carriage, while Agrick couldn't help but feel awkward seeing his father act so submissively. Eventually his embarrassment faded as his eyes widened, taking in the grandeur of the castle. As they finally entered, Lily couldn't help but notice how happy Dime seemed to be back home. And why wouldn't he be? With a house like this and such wealthy parents, it would be easier for his talents to develop than he had ever imagined possible. 2 months passed after that day. We now find Lily talking to her son, who had begun to babble. She was delighted that he was finally making sounds, while the boy was equally fascinated to experience babbling for the first time, something he had never heard before. You see, chances to meet small children had been rare during his time wandering the battlefield. The few children he saw were often swaddled and crying with nowhere to go. Many mourned parents who had slowly succumbed to destruction and vanished. Compared with that, his new home was fortunate and prosperous, and he was relieved that he would not go hungry here. Suddenly, his father burst into the room with excitement, holding a spear in hand. He proudly announced that it was called a spear. Our boy was not exactly a fan of his father's enthusiastic side. He found it hard to believe that this man, his father, was the strongest exact-class lancer of the empire. Known as Dane Sogress, although he hardly looked like a war hero, he was in fact one famously called the Blue Tornado. His wife became irritated and started pushing him away from the child, asking how he could enter their son's room with something so sharp. The man began to lose his composure under her intense gaze and timidly said he only wanted to show it to them, but she radiated a deadly aura, reminding him that she had already said they would not teach their son anything until he reached an appropriate age. It was no surprise that this grown man trembled under her piercing eyes, for his wife was the greatest assassin in the empire. She argued that if he continued like this, she would also teach their son the fundamentals of stealth while he was still young. Arkan tried to argue that everyone was investing in early education these days. Even one of the famous magic houses, known as the Teleport House, placed a staff next to a child as soon as they were born. But his wife grew annoyed again and asked if a spear now looked like a staff to him. Meanwhile, our boy reflected that the reason his parents placed such importance on his future was that his 2 older sisters had chosen careers unrelated to spear fighting or assassination. Soon we see his 2 sisters playing with their little brother, making his cheeks ache. One of them, Arabella, laughed that his chubby cheeks were the cutest thing ever. While Arabella overflowed with energy, his sister Claire was the complete opposite, nervous and calm. She shyly offered to teach him summoning later, saying it was a useful skill to have. Like Arabella, Claire was a talented girl who excelled at summoning. She had managed her first summoning at the age of 7 and could now handle 2 summons at the same time. Arabella teased Claire, telling her to touch him and insisting he was very soft. Claire hesitated, unsure if she should. Meanwhile, Dime acted adorable and friendly, reflecting that he had initially thought Claire did not like him. Now he realized it was more like jealousy. After all, he was the youngest in the family now, stealing all the attention. Eventually, Claire reached out and gently touched his nose. She was thrilled and exclaimed at how soft he really was. She touched him again and promised to teach him everything when he grew older. Dime couldn't help but think it was a bit over the top, how everyone wanted to pass their own specialties on to him. His father was an exact-class lancer. His mother was a talented, though retired, assassin. His eldest sister was a genius mage, and Claire was a gifted summoner. The house of Count Sogress was the perfect noble family, the ideal family he had always imagined. He wondered whether there was any reason to seek revenge in this new life. Of course his death had been tragic, but that battlefield was just that, a battlefield. It was almost amusing to think about revenge now. To take revenge on someone who defeated him fairly now seemed pointless. The whole family gathered in the grand hall, debating with one another and trying to convince each other that their own specialties would suit Dime best. Watching this warm argument brought a smile to Dime's face. This was the kind of family he had always wished for, and he felt happy to have been born here. But as tempers flared and voices rose, he began to wonder if this was truly what a harmonious family looked like. Soon we learned about a special tradition in the Sogress household known as the ceremony of choice. When a child of the family turns 1 year old, several objects are placed on a table before them and people try to predict the child's future based on the item they pick. Today was young Master Daim's turn. He had just celebrated his first birthday, and now he would choose his path. Guests murmured excitedly, recalling how the older sisters had become a mage and a summoner. And wondering what young Daim would select, they moved toward the ceremonial hall to witness the decision. Inside the great hall, Daim sat near 4 different items, each representing a distinct class. As the crowd gathered around the table, his mother told him gently that he only needed to pick what he liked. Yet Daim didn't seem sure what to choose. He glanced at his father, who was clearly hoping he would pick the spear. His father smiled, convinced that the little boy would be drawn to the dragon-tailed spearhead. This spearhead was apparently crafted from rare Dakran, and when infused with mana it became as sharp and heavy as the energy poured into it. His mother, meanwhile, looked proud and serene, thinking Daim was far too handsome to become an assassin, but she was still certain he would choose the dagger. This was no ordinary blade, it was called the Night Horn, forged from ethereal ore capable of holding every element and storing multiple poisons. Their eldest daughter was equally confident that her little brother would carry on the mage's legacy and choose the enchanted pouch. This was no common bag but a special subspace pouch, usable only by those with magical talent. Claire, quiet as always, wondered shyly if Dad might become a summoner. Before him lay a summoning sigil, a tool for summoners to receive a code aligned with their talent, allowing them to call forth their creatures. But Daim was confused and uncertain, because he could literally hear the thoughts of every family member. After a deep sigh, he finally made his decision. Crawling toward the objects, he stirred a wave of excitement through the crowd. As he picked up speed, his parents and sisters beamed with pride, cheering him on in their own ways. His father encouraged him to choose something strong and resilient, while his mother urged him to pick something short and sharp. As Daim neared the table, a golden light suddenly shone from all 4 items at once. He had no idea what was happening, and neither did his family. The crowd, however, gasped in shock and excitement as they realized that all 4 items had reacted, something completely unheard of. They couldn't help but admit that the young master seemed to be a once-in-a-generation prodigy. Dane was just as astonished. He remembered how talented he had been as a soldier on the battlefield, but in this life he felt he was on an entirely different level. Little Arabella asked her father what they should do since nothing like this had ever happened before. Both parents looked equally bewildered, realizing this meant they would need to teach their son all 4 disciplines. Their conclusion stunned the other guests, while Daim only smiled warmly in response. Time passed and we next found ourselves in a training hall where the sound of clashing weapons rang out. It was none other than Daim and his father sparring. Our boy had grown a great deal since we last saw him. Just 30 seconds ago it seemed. Agrick grinned broadly at his son's impressive progress, proud that Daim had mastered the technique he'd taught earlier. The boy thanked his father, and we learned that Daim was now 7 years old. As they shared a cheerful laugh, a man suddenly appeared, carrying a spear. Daim watched with curiosity as the newcomer presented it. Agrick had clearly been expecting the delivery. He quickly took the spear and offered it to Daim, explaining that this was his birthday gift. Agrick said he had originally planned to present it during the official birthday banquet, but wanted Daim to have it before his mother's gift. He added that he had been preparing this spear for 2 years and had commissioned it from a renowned craftsman in the capital. He wished his son a happy 7th birthday in advance. Overjoyed, Daim immediately set aside his old practice staff and grabbed the new spear, declaring that he would use it because it was simply amazing. He admired how the black shaft and the silver spearhead complemented each other, and he was surprised by how light it felt. His father asked if he liked it, and he replied that he loved it. In fact, he was so excited that he immediately began to twirl it in his hands. His father then asked if he knew the difference between a sword and a spear. Danny explained that, because of the spear's length, it could keep opponents at a distance effectively, and due to its small point of contact it had a high attack efficiency. His father agreed, saying that was true, but warned that as Danny grew stronger, the spear would actually become harder to use than a sword. He pointed out the fundamental problem with spears. To attack properly, you needed to maintain a minimum distance between yourself and your opponent. Still, he told his son not to worry too much, since every weapon had its pros and cons. Even swords, often called the perfect weapon, could be weak in certain situations. Danny brightened at that and promised to remember it. His father then began to spin the spear in his hand and invited his son to train so he could demonstrate something. Danny was completely awed by the power radiating from his father. This was the first time he had witnessed the overwhelming energy of an Exa-class lancer. The magical force his father released was simply staggering. After gathering his energy, his father thrust the spear forward, and the space around the tip began to distort. He explained that the distortion occurred because he had released his magical power while wielding the spear. This technique used the core's ability to concentrate magical power in one place. Danny remarked that he had heard about this from his sister and explained that humans could surpass their physical limits as the number of their mana cores increased, which meant their potential could expand. He reflected that in his past life he had possessed a quadruple core, and all this knowledge came from that previous existence. Meanwhile, his father smiled broadly, impressed by how much his son had studied, and reminded him that he now had 6 mana cores. Naturally, Danny pretended to be shocked, but inwardly he thought that if he had not died, he might have reached 6 cores in his former life as well. His father encouraged him to try the new spear. Danny hesitated, but his father told him to relax his mind, forget his worries, and simply thrust the weapon. Danny agreed, and as he held the spear, he reflected that in his past life he had never been interested in spears. Having discovered a talent for swordsmanship back then, he had used spears only as a secondary option. Now at last it was time to truly try. He took his stance, closed his eyes, and his father noted how good his form already was. Agrick couldn't help smiling from ear to ear. It had taken him 7 years to master this very technique. But since his son was still so young, he wondered if Danny could actually perform it. The moment Dan thrust the spear, reality itself seemed to shift, completely shattering his father's expectations. Agrick was stunned, shouting in disbelief and demanding to know how his son knew so much. When Dan finished the technique, his father approached, laughing and praising him for an impressive performance. Danny explained that, as he thrust the spear, he concentrated his magical power in a single point and infused it into the tip. When the energy reached the spearhead, he cut off the flow. His father was nearly beside himself with excitement, asking if he had formed a mana core. Danny calmly said yes, claiming that while reading a book about creating mana cores, he had decided to experiment and had luckily succeeded. Of course, he was lying. The truth was that he had formed the core while practicing mana breathing. His father knelt to meet his eyes, unable to hide his pride. He was certain that one day his son would become an extraordinary warrior. Danny only smiled faintly, thinking of all the surprises he still had in store that would surely astonish his father. Agrick, meanwhile, wondered whether his son might truly become a mage, a lancer, an assassin, and a summoner all at once. When night fell, Dane's 7th birthday celebration finally began. Guests filled the castle as music and laughter echoed through the great hall. Everyone was enjoying themselves immensely. Among the guests was Duke Bateau, the very man who had killed Dan in his previous life. When Agrick saw him, he called out to start a conversation. Agrick addressed him by the title Duke. Bateau told him to drop the formality and speak as they usually did. As we know, Duke Bateau belonged to the imperial house of Elan and was the head of the Termian duchy. Agrick quickly stepped closer to his friend and whispered that many people were watching, so he needed to maintain the appearance of formality. The Duke chuckled, saying Agrick could do as he pleased, and then asked where his son was. At that moment, Agrick called for Dan and told him to greet the Duke of Termian. The instant Dan heard that name, memories of his past life and of his final encounter with this man came rushing back. When the boy finally stood before the Duke, he introduced himself as Danrys and bowed his head, saying it was an honor to meet him. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Danrys said politely. The Duke laughed, impressed by the boy's manners, and asked the father if Dan was also learning to use a spear. Agrick confirmed that he was. At that moment, a young lady approached Duke Apot from behind, and when Dan's eyes fell on her, he was momentarily surprised. The girl greeted Count Sogress with a respectful bow to show her good manners. She introduced herself as Lala Termian, the youngest daughter of the Termian Duchy. After the introductions, the celebration continued. The guests enjoyed the music and the beautiful night, but the same could not be said for Dane Sogress and Bal Termian. The reason was that the Baroness of Termian remained ill. Despite Bal's best efforts to find a cure or treatment, nothing had worked. Arkan hoped this was only a temporary trial and that his friend's wife would recover soon. Still, Bal warned that if he suddenly disappeared, it would mean his wife's condition had worsened and he would use a teleportation path to return to the capital. For now, though, it was Dan's party, and Dan had quietly slipped away. To Bal, the boy seemed clever and he wanted to talk with him more. Arkan also realized that his son had disappeared, along with Layla. Finding them was easy enough. The two had gone for a walk together. They likely found the formal party as dull as many other noble gatherings. What they were talking about, however, was a mystery to their parents. Layla was especially talkative. To be honest, she disliked following her father to all these noble parties, but this time she was glad she had come. She had heard many times how handsome Dan was, but under the moonlight he looked even better, and she liked this quiet place. Dan was happy to hear that. Unlike the bustling capital, the Sogress family's territory was peaceful and calm. That was why Layla envied him. At her own home there was always something happening. Nobles arrived every day with business proposals and offers for her father. Sometimes even the imperial family appeared, and every single time someone visited she had to dress formally and go out to greet them. Something she absolutely hated. Instead of all that, she wished she could wear something simple and practical and practice with her sword all day. Dan was surprised that such a small and seemingly delicate girl practiced with a sword instead of magic. He himself loved his quiet territory. It wasn't as hectic as the capital, which gave him plenty of free time to train with the spear that he simply adored. Layla was startled at first to learn he trained with a spear, but then she remembered his father's nickname, the Blue Whirlwind, and everything made sense. She had often heard her father speak of how amazing the Blue Whirlwind was. Since Dan practiced so diligently with the spear, Layla assumed he wanted to enter the academy. Yet that wasn't his reason at all, and her surprise was evident when he said so. For her, training hard to get into the academy was the obvious goal. She had heard how incredibly difficult it was to gain admission. Dan, however, didn't doubt for a moment that he would be accepted. He trained simply to become even better once he entered. Layla could hardly believe his confidence, so she asked what he would do if he failed. Even in that case, he said calmly, he wouldn't be upset or give up. He would simply try again. And if he failed a second time, he would take it as a sign that this path wasn't meant for him. Layla found such a carefree attitude toward the future astonishing. She asked if he wasn't afraid of disappointing his family or his home. Naturally, our hero wasn't worried at all. Compared with the hardships of his past life, this was nothing. Layla, on the other hand, couldn't help but envy him. In her family, failure was unacceptable. Although Dan had lived among nobles for 7 years, he was still surprised by how petty they could be about such things. As for Layla, he had no doubt she would succeed. When she heard his encouraging words, she brightened immediately and offered to show Dan her sword skills. Our hero was a bit surprised by her enthusiasm, but there was no stopping her when an opportunity to practice appeared. Layla immediately asked where the training grounds were, and Dan had to guide her there, hoping nothing would go wrong. At the training field, Layla held nothing back. She executed one movement after another like an experienced swordswoman. To an untrained eye, her techniques might have seemed flawless, but our hero was far from a beginner. Watching her carefully, he had to admit that her transitions from attack to defense and back again were impressively smooth, and the timing of her strikes was excellent. But there was one flaw. After a while her movements lost their rhythm, and the fluidity began to fade. Breathing hard after the exercise, a satisfied Layla asked him what he thought of her skills. At first Dan wasn't entirely honest. He told her she had performed wonderfully, and that he enjoyed watching. Layla was quite pleased with the compliment, but Dan decided to be truthful. He pointed out that she still had room for improvement. For example, after the third form she was taking a half step more than necessary, and that extra half step appeared again in the following forms. Those repeated half steps The extra half steps made the later sword forms slightly misaligned. Such criticism left Layla speechless. She looked as if she might cry, and Dane began to wonder if his remarks had been too blunt. He even started to apologize for upsetting her, saying he might be wrong since it had been a long time since he'd watched a true swordsman, but his worry was unnecessary. Layla quickly regained her composure and gripped the sword more firmly. Now she understood her mistake. She repeated the training movements again, and this time they were flawless. Dane's advice had been the missing piece that brought her technique to perfection. Her joy and gratitude were boundless. She even hugged Dane. Our hero tried to resist, but not very successfully. Layla was simply fascinated by how much he knew about swordsmanship. In an instant she realized she had been practicing incorrectly all this time, something her teachers had never mentioned. She promised to remember his help. Eventually she let Den go, almost suffocating him in her arms, but then nearly cut him with the sword as she released him. That little lady really needed a lesson in organization. Den was caught off guard by the sudden embrace, though he couldn't say he disliked it. Of course, their private moment was soon interrupted by the shouts of servants searching everywhere for them. They had already taken enough of a break from the banquet and didn't intend to hide. They hurried back so they wouldn't be discovered at the training field. When they returned, Dane became the center of attention as his parents officially congratulated him on both his birthday and his first manticore discovery. Naturally, they presented him with a gift, a brooch bearing the family crest, similar to those worn by his older sisters. His mother advised him to treasure it, as this brooch would now serve as proof of his status and honor. After his parents, all the guests joined in offering their congratulations. Dane had now officially and truly earned the Sogress name. No one present doubted that he would grow into a good man like his father. Dan's parents were overjoyed, and the young Dan was as well. It was the first time in both of his lives that he had received such warm congratulations from so many people. Suddenly the entire hall trembled. Guests began shouting, unsure whether it was an earthquake or an enemy invasion. Dan also grew concerned, but his father quickly reassured him there was no need to be afraid. Dane Sogress knew exactly what was happening. Although he had hoped for a quiet day, apparently his daughter had other plans. Dan truly had no idea. Lightning flashed near the ceiling of the hall, and within seconds a portal appeared above the startled guests. Their astonishment only grew when a small figure shot out of the portal, defying the laws of physics, and landed gracefully on the floor. It was Dan's eldest sister, Arabella, and in her opinion she was not late at all. The guests could barely close their mouths in shock, amazed that such a young lady could already use teleportation magic. Normally, opening even a small portal required at least 5th chain mastery. Dan didn't admire her power so much as he felt irritated by her noisy, dramatic entrance. Yet, as soon as the guests calmed slightly, an enormous creature appeared in the sky, a massive wyvern with a rider. This time Lady Claire had managed to startle the staff and guests alike. She was in a foul mood, but had missed arriving before her sister by only a step. As soon as she entered, guests whispered about her reputation as a brilliant summoner. No one had expected her to command a wyvern at only 16 years old. Finally, they were all home again. Together, the sisters stood before their parents and brothers to wish their favorite little brother, Dan, a happy birthday. After their dramatic entrances, the sisters eagerly handed over their gifts while offering their well wishes. Dan thanked Arabella and Claire for coming home. Even though they were busy with their studies, the girls were excited to watch their little brother open the presents. Duke Arkan nearly cried at the special treatment his son was receiving. His daughters had given him only a letter on his own birthday. At last, Dan opened the box Arabella had brought. Inside was a ring that transformed into a convenient dimensional pouch. She had designed the artifact herself. The subspace magic used in its creation belonged to the highest chain, and Arabella's renowned professor had helped apply it to the ring. It was common knowledge how difficult it was to imbue any item with subspace magic. Arabella gently took her brother's hand and slid the ring onto his finger. She must have spent a great deal of time designing an artifact capable of supporting an entire subspace. She also embedded Dan's genetic code into the ring so that no one but her little brother could use it. It was a truly unique item. Mother Lily examined the ring and saw a faint ripple of mana running through the artifact, proof that it had been crafted with the finest magical stones. Arabella explained that all Dan needed to do was channel a bit of mana into the ring and the subspace would be established. It was far more convenient than ordinary storage bags. The very fact that this was more convenient than normal dimensional bags made the artifact priceless. From what Dan remembered, such a tool was something only the wealthy used on the battlefield. Only commanders of noble origin and high-ranking mages possessed such a convenient power. The ring would also grow as he aged, adapting to his body. Danny tried channeling his mana into the artifact, and a green portal opened in front of everyone. The Duke was stunned to see his son accomplish this with such ease. Claire, Duke Beltermian, and Layla were amazed by the brilliant display of magic. Dan managed to open a subspace faster than Arabella had years ago. He was a genius, there was no doubt about it. It would be a groundbreaking achievement if he could cultivate both a mana core and a magic circle at the same time. After the magical demonstration, Claire approached her little brother and handed him her gift. Dan opened it slowly, thanking his older sister sincerely. Inside the wooden box was a peculiar-looking egg resting on a soft cloth. Confused, he picked up the egg and asked what it was. Claire panicked and warned him to be careful with it as it was no ordinary egg. Everyone in the family was curious about the strange present, but Claire revealed its secret only to Dan. She whispered that it was a familiar. She had obtained it by accident while trying to summon Decaron. Even Claire herself didn't know what would hatch from it, but everyone in the world understood how precious a familiar could be. Danny tried to imagine what might emerge from the mysterious egg. He had heard of familiars before. Unlike regular summons, they were an entirely different entity. Once summoned, a familiar could remain permanently in the real world. Claire instructed Dan to keep the egg a secret until it hatched. He promised he would. All the whispering between the two irritated Arabella, who felt left out. As for Claire's instructions, Danny was to pour a bit of his mana into the egg once in the morning and once at night so it would recognize him as its master. Lily was simply happy that her little one was receiving such incredible gifts. It showed how much the siblings cared for one another. With the exchange of presents complete, Duke Arkan cleared his throat and reminded his daughters to at least greet their parents, since they had arrived at the party after saying they might not be able to come. Realizing they hadn't spoken a word to their parents since their arrival, the girls awkwardly greeted their father. The Duke was a true softie when it came to his daughters, so he didn't mind. He was just happy to see them again. Since leaving to pursue their professions, the girls rarely returned home. Duke Arkan was delighted to see them looking well. From a distance, Layla watched the Sogress family being so lovingly loud and joyful with one another. The girl couldn't help but compare her own family situation to theirs. Danny noticed her watching and turned his head. He saw the drop in her mood as she quietly stepped away. He wondered why she seemed so lonely and sad in the middle of a lively crowd of nobles. The banquet ended, and the next day arrived. Duke Buttermond stayed the night and was now walking through the Sogress territory. He couldn't stop thinking about how incredibly talented Arabella Sogress was. As expected of the top mage of the academy, her magical talent was unmatched. She might be the perfect match for the son of Duke Termion, the academy's best swordsman. If the Sogress and Termion houses could unite through a marriage between the two, it would create a faction powerful enough to rival even the imperial family. If that happened, no one could challenge either house or their children. So Duke Termion decided to raise the question of engagement between their eldest children in today's conversation with Arkan. On his way to meet the other Duke, Termion heard the sound of clashing steel nearby. It came from the training grounds. Someone was honing their technique incredibly early in the morning. Of course, it was Dan, fully focused on refining his spear skills. He had become truly deadly with the weapon. With years of training under his father and an intense work ethic, he was long ready for combat. Dane's concentration was unparalleled. He moved with the fluidity and precision of a veteran warrior, striking multiple lethal blows as he darted across the training field. He increased his speed even further, intensifying his rhythm. Finally, his arms blurred as he delivered countless spear thrusts in a short span of time. Curiosity got the better of Duke Termion, who ended up watching the boys training from a distance. He was pleasantly surprised to see the youngest son of House Sogress, pushing himself to the extreme. With his experienced eyes, the Duke could discern how incredibly refined Dane's technique was. His movements and focus were nothing like those of a 7-year-old boy. Even his simplest strikes were honed to a terrifying degree. Everything was executed with perfection that veteran spearmen with years of battlefield experience could still learn from him. When Dane finally finished his last sequence, he was breathless. Duke Termian was completely impressed from start to finish. What he had just witnessed seemed impossible. He had heard rumors. The rumors about the young Sogress possessing incredible talent, even as a baby, had always seemed like exaggerated gossip to Duke Termian. Now he knew those rumors were true. After a brief pause, Dane resumed practicing, this time focusing on his movements and posture. As one of the strongest swordsmen in the region, the Duke could not help but notice that the boy's stance and movements resembled those of a master swordsman. He began to consider that the child might have learned swordsmanship at a high level at such a young age. Eventually, Dane sensed someone watching him from the doorway. He brandished his spear, ready to strike, and warned the observer to step out instead of hiding. Duke Termian, excited yet embarrassed, realized he had been discovered by a mere boy, not his proudest moment as a seasoned warrior. The more he thought about Dane's footwork, the more strangely familiar it seemed. He was certain he had seen that same pattern somewhere before. The Duke stepped forward and apologized to Dane for eavesdropping on his private training session, insisting he meant nothing suspicious. Seeing that the onlooker was Duke Termian, Dane felt guilty for speaking so sharply. Though he had lived in this body for 7 years, this man was still the one who had defeated and killed him in his previous life. Remembering his etiquette training, Dane greeted the Duke formally. Duke Termian confessed that he was fascinated by the boy's morning training and apologized again. But Dane held his ground, replying that he was forgiven. The Duke found amusement in the child's courage to speak as though they were equals. Now that he was closer, Termian noticed that the boy's body showed no signs of fatigue or trembling despite the intense workout. At the same age, the Duke himself hadn't even formed a single manticore. The Duke complimented Dane's excellent thrusting attack, remarking that the boy had clearly inherited Arkan's talent with the spear. He also admired the craftsmanship of the weapon. Dane thanked him formally, and the older man smiled. This child was not only a lethal fighter but also knew exactly what to say at the right moment. In comparison, his own son had possessed neither such skills nor such manners at age 7. This brief encounter led Duke Termian to seriously consider arranging a marriage between Layla and Dan as well. Casually, he mentioned that his daughter had also been training in swordsmanship. Since they were of similar age, he suggested they look out for each other when they entered the academy in the future. Dan responded politely, and the Duke enjoyed the boy's forthrightness. Finally, Duke Termian excused himself so as not to interrupt Dane's training any longer. But before leaving the practice hall, he could not resist one last question. He wanted to know whether the boy had also trained in swordsmanship. Dane made a small mistake in front of the Duke. Ol quickly recognized those subtle tells. Dane answered that he had only read a few manuals on basic swordsmanship and had never trained formally. The Duke still found it odd that he sensed something like a raw battlefield instinct in the child, but common sense dictated that an inexperienced boy could not possess such a killer's intuition. At last, the Duke took his leave and Dane escorted him to the exit. Before departing, Duke Termian invited Dane to visit him if he ever came to the capital. The seasoned swordsman had taken a personal interest in the boy's talent. Dane wondered whether the man remembered him. Just thinking about defeating the one who had ended his life before made his blood boil. If he built a solid foundation and prepared step by step, he was certain he could surpass the Duke. One of his life's goals was to defeat the powerful Buttermon Termian in this lifetime. Continuing his training, Dane lost track of time, and Hernan, his attendant, had to come fetch him. Hernan had been silently watching the boy from the shadows, always ready to meet his needs. With Hernan's quiet presence, Dane realized that this man might have enough talent to learn assassination and stealth skills himself. Everyone was busy preparing for the second banquet of the celebration. Some nobles had already begun to arrive. Gathering more than 30 noble families on the exact date was no easy task. As for Dane's sisters, they had already opened a teleportation portal and returned to the academy together. They had midterm exams coming soon. For now it was time for Dane to wash up and dress. He made a mental note to examine more closely the gifts his sisters had given him the night before. After his intense training, Dane was bathed, dressed, and ready. He entered the family hall with his mother and father and mingled with the various nobles. Throughout the evening, he had to put his etiquette training into practice while conversing with high society. As the birthday boy, he was the center of attention, with every eye upon him. Finally, he managed to slip out of the banquet hall to catch his breath. The life of a noble was exhausting. His schedule was busier than usual because it was his birthday, but at least Dan could always find comfort resting in his beautiful garden. Mr. Garner had worked hard to cultivate this special place into a scene of peaceful beauty. Dane gazed at the flowers in full bloom, bursting with unique colors as butterflies danced around them. He remembered his older sister explaining how flowers held more natural mana than most things. Since he had a bit of free time, he decided to analyze the mana in those flowers. Closing his eyes, he focused on the natural flow of magic in the air. Without opening them, he began to grasp the concept his sister had described. He started to feel the mana within the flowers. Though he had been training in several disciplines, he had not seen notable progress in wizardry or summoning magic. He struggled to decide which field deserved his time. Having too much talent could be a curse at moments like this. He was practically suffering from success. After a few minutes immersed in the garden's natural mana, he finally sensed the energy inside the flowers. He could hardly believe something so small could hold such a powerful current. If one could feel the flow of nature and somehow make it their own, that principle could settle into the body to form a magic circle. That was exactly what was happening now. It helped that his body's mana affinity was already tremendous. He could clearly see what others might only sense vaguely with a sixth sense. Just a single visit to the garden had sharpened his mana perception enormously. What he had barely seen before now became crystal clear. He was on the verge of understanding the inner workings of magic when he suddenly felt something shatter. Meanwhile, two noble children had also wandered into the garden, bored of the adults' small talk in the banquet hall. They were brothers. The older, a redhead, was irritated that no one was paying attention to him. As everyone spoke of the Sogress genius, he stomped aggressively across the flower beds, crushing blossoms as he went. Lost in the vast garden, the red-haired brothers stumbled upon Dane, who was standing quietly, distracted. They glanced at his clothes and mistakenly assumed he was a servant, shouting at him. He did not appreciate such disrespect. The arrogant older boy even had the audacity to order Dane to guide them out. Dane saw what they were doing to the flowers and shouted at them to stop trampling the plants. The red-haired brute felt offended at being scolded. Dane asked why they were destroying the flower beds instead of using the proper garden paths. The older boy, seeing how small Dane was, continued his annoying behavior. Next came the inevitable display of the family name. As all young nobles did, Dane didn't care. To him, they were just a pair of bullies ruining his garden's flower beds. The red-haired boy didn't like being called a brute, yet he acted exactly like one, grabbing Dane by the collar. They were sons of Count Tyron, a guest of the castle. Hearing that name stirred Dane's memories of his past life. That man had been the noble he captured after a humiliating battlefield defeat. Dane remembered Count Tyron as an irritating aristocrat, a true scoundrel. Based on the behavior of the bully before him now, the phrase "like father, like son" felt perfect. The red-haired brat kept flaunting his family name, bragging that they were famous in the capital. He even boasted that his house could make Dane disappear without a trace, so he'd better watch his words. Dane knew plenty of fools like this boy from before. He also knew words would never penetrate the thick skull of this red-headed idiot. The boy raised his fist to strike Dane, still thinking he was merely abusing a servant. Dane had no intention of letting that happen. Instead, he responded by slamming his forehead into the boy's nose with full force, a critical hit that nearly broke it. The younger brother shouted in alarm, checking on his older sibling, who was sprawled on the ground after the blow. Seeing the blood on his hands, the red-haired boy panicked as if he had never bled before. When he realized it was his own blood, his temper flared and he threatened to kill Dane. Finding the threat amusing, Dane calmly challenged him to try. The red-haired brat wanted blood for blood. His younger brother, showing more sense, tried to stop him, but the older boy was too arrogant to listen. The brute threw a punch, but Dane easily dodged, leaping back. It was a complete mismatch. Dane was far too quick and slippery for an amateur. As he let the red-haired boy tire himself out, he noted the sloppy footwork like someone who had never even held a weapon. Dane guessed the boy might be a mage or a summoner. The barrage of punches continued, none of them coming close to touching a single hair on Dane's head. The bully's nose kept bleeding as his patience wore thin. Dane, meanwhile, toyed with his opponent, using his superior movement, and then an idea came to him. Perhaps he could take advantage of the flow of magic that he remembered the mana he had sensed in the flowers earlier, and decided to incorporate his will into it. If he succeeded, he would be able to compress that force into a physical form. This fight was the perfect opportunity to test it. The younger brother of the red-haired bully watched with his mouth wide open as Dan planted his feet firmly and began gathering magic in his hands. He visualized a ball of pure mana and launched it straight at the older boy's stomach. The force was powerful enough to knock the red-haired brat painfully onto the grass, even cracking the stone path along the way. The boy screamed in agony, his body and pride both wounded. His little brother hurried to check on him, but Dane was more concerned about the ruined flower bed than about the bully's well-being. Yet the red-haired boy was tenacious. He still had enough strength to stand again. Seeing that Dane could use magic, the brat demanded to know who he really was. The younger brother kept trying to discourage the elder, but the boy's pride was too wounded for him to care about consequences. The redhead summoned manhua within his own body and began to open some sort of sinister portal. Dane was surprised to witness such a familiar scene. This was the magic of a summoner. Mana swirled and condensed until a translucent wolf began to descend to the ground. The beast looked bloodthirsty and predatory, bearing sharp fangs as it growled. The red-haired boy laughed maniacally as he called his summoned creature JP. He finally introduced himself as Confronting the Tyron, ready to show Dane the consequences of challenging someone of his status. Degron ordered the wolf to tear Dane apart, but Dane remained unimpressed. Compared to the terrifying creatures his sister Claire could summon, like her mighty wyvern, this wolf was hardly worth noticing. As JP lunged, Dane simply locked eyes with the beast and didn't move. Somehow the wolf seemed to sense it would meet a horrible fate if it attacked. It abruptly turned and spun around, its aura changing completely as its aggression melted away. The Tyron brothers were stunned. Degron's proud summon had apparently betrayed him. The great wolf now behaved like a submissive puppy before Dan. Degron shouted frantically, ordering the creature to rip Dane's throat out, but his commands fell on deaf ears. Instead, the wolf wagged its tail happily at Dan. Sensing no malice from the summoned beast, Dane gently patted the good boy, though even he had no idea why this reversal had happened. Thinking back, he realized that even Claire's summons had always been unusually friendly toward him. Her wyvern sometimes played with him as well. He had assumed it was only because of their shared bloodline, but this situation with no family ties involved proved otherwise. It likely meant he possessed an abnormally high affinity for all kinds of summoned creatures. Whatever the case, Degron's favor with his own summon had clearly collapsed. Degron could not comprehend what was happening. He had never heard of a summon betraying its master. Dane was winning on every front, and continued to provoke Degron to come closer. The younger brother practically begged his sibling to stop embarrassing himself, but it was no use. The poor boy was so frightened he wet his pants. He cried while Degron cursed him as a disgrace. Dane twisted the knife in their pride by casually pointing out that the castle's main basement had a bath. Using his little brother's accident as an excuse, Degron finally retreated. As if he hadn't already humiliated himself enough, he ordered Dane to stay in the garden before fleeing. Dane merely watched the pathetic loser with disgust. Degron didn't even take his own summoned creature with him. Left alone, Dane resumed experimenting with his new understanding of mana. He practiced a trick Claire had taught him earlier, identifying the faint remaining link between Dagron and JP. With care, Dane severed that weak bond and rewrote it with his own magic. In doing so, he and the wolf became officially connected. Without ever performing a formal summoning, the boy had accomplished an intricate feat simply by leveraging his extraordinary affinity with summoned beasts. He had now effectively become a summoner. While he was savoring this quiet triumph, Dane heard a familiar and irritating voice calling for him. The Tyron had, in fact, gone to fetch his father and was now tattling that he had been bullied in the garden. He pointed at Dane while pinching his nose to stop the bleeding, whining that the boy had struck him and stolen his summon. The formidable Mulgar Tyron, head of the powerful Tyron family and one of the great nobles of the capital, strode forward with blustering energy. He demanded to know whether Dane had truly beaten his son and taken control of his summoned beast. Our young hero was not the type to back down from a pompous noble. He stood his ground and calmly admitted what he had done. He realized that Mulgar Tyron was far fatter now than when he had once captured the boar as a prisoner. Clearly, the peaceful times had treated him well, even though he had been a disgrace on the battlefield. Mulgar continued to throw his weight around, declaring that he could not let this matter slide. No one could meddle with his children and expect him to ignore it. The pompous man fired off a barrage of demanding questions and finally insisted that the boy reveal his identity. Our young hero lifted his head proudly and introduced himself formally as Dane Sogress, youngest son of Dane Sogress, Lord of the South and head of the noble Sogress family. It was a presentation worthy of a royal court. That single introduction left both father and son dumbfounded. They had unknowingly insulted the birthday boy himself, and had no idea they were provoking one of the most promising rising stars of Sudak. Mulgar was stunned to encounter the youngest son of House Sogress so unexpectedly. Thinking of the great noble houses, Mulgar recalled how he had once been taken prisoner by Agrick and had contributed nothing of value during the war, a humiliation that made the other nobles laugh at him. Now he saw a perfect opportunity to turn the situation to his advantage. He planned to tarnish the Sogress name and use it as a pretext to demand mining rights. Soon the very nobles who once mocked him would be bowing before him. With that scheme in mind, the blustering man turned back to the boy and asked if he was indeed the birthday celebrant. Dane, my friend, simply nodded in confirmation. Mulgar could barely contain his frustration. He certainly had not come here to celebrate some child's birthday. He pointed to his unruly son Dagron and demanded to know how Dane intended to compensate for the humiliation he had caused. Dane, he said, had not only injured his son, a guest of House Sogress, but had also stolen his summon, a serious crime. Dagron eagerly agreed with his father's accusation, sneering that this would be Dane's last day. The overfed noble then threatened the boy, saying he would personally speak with Count Sogress and hold him responsible for his son's actions. Dane calmly acknowledged the tirade but stated firmly that before anyone went to his father, Dagron should apologize first. That infuriated Mulgar, who demanded to know what nonsense the boy was talking about, while Dagron ground his teeth in rage. But Dane stood his ground. He explained that yes, he had struck Dagron and hurt him, but it had been in self-defense against a threat to his life. Moreover, he had not stolen the summon. Genpu had chosen to follow him of his own will. The spoiled son protested loudly, insisting there was no way Genpu would ever do that and accusing Dane of lying. At that moment Mulgar paused to think. He remembered hearing that the second daughter of House Sogress was a prodigy in summoning. It seemed entirely possible that she had taught Dane how to break the bond between a summoner and his beast. The corpulent man went back and forth with Dane, who found the exchange increasingly tiresome. Eventually Mulgar decided to calm himself after so much bluster. Even his jaw was starting to ache. He finally said he would not scold Dane further, and declared that they should hear what Count Sogress himself had to say. As if summoned by the very conversation, the Count arrived on the scene accompanied by Duke Termian. Naturally, both the ill-mannered son and his overbearing father were stunned to see the Count in person, and even more surprised that the Duke was with him. As night fell, the red-haired boy gave his testimony to the Count, claiming that he and his little brother had simply gotten lost in the garden and asked Dane for directions. He spun an elaborate story saying that Dane suddenly headbutted him and mocked him with strange magic. To scare Dane, Degron claimed he had called his summon, but Dane somehow stole the creature and counterattacked. When Degron finished, Mogar stepped forward, saying he only intended to give Dane a warning. Still, he insisted that stealing someone's summon was clearly wrong and could not be overlooked. At last Count Sogress spoke, telling Mogar that he would not pass judgment after hearing only one side of the dispute. He wanted to hear Dane's account before making any decision. To reassure Mogar, the Count added that if Mogar worried about bias, Duke Termian would also give his opinion. The Duke quickly offered a slight smile and said that if the matter was truly so important, he was more than willing to help settle it. Mogar's frustration deepened, and sweat began to bead on his round face. war-orphan-turned-warrior was sweating profusely. He knew he was about to be in serious trouble. Bringing Duke Termian into the matter only made things more complicated. And he felt a growing sense of dread. Count Sogress gave his son a small nod to speak, and Dane prepared himself, explaining that what Mogar's son had said was not entirely accurate, though some parts were true. He went on to describe how the flowers they had so carefully cultivated in the garden were trampled, exactly as he had claimed earlier. He had simply told Mogar's son to leave, which enraged the boy and started the fight. Both the fat noble and his son were stunned by this blunt truth, the younger even trying to deny it and calling Dane a liar. But the Count urged Dane to continue. Dane explained that when Mogar's son summoned Genpu, his command had been to kill. He clarified that he never stole the summon. Genpu had approached him first, sensing his goodwill. The Duke was astonished that this 7-year-old boy spoke with such grace and carefully chosen words. Dane repeated firmly that he had not stolen anyone's summon. Mogar lost control, stamping his foot and calling the claim absurd. He insisted it was impossible for a summon to submit to someone who was not a summoner, accusing Dane of using some shady technique. Unbothered, Dane replied that he possessed an innate affinity with summons and that a creature not truly bonded with its master could indeed yield to someone like him. Mogar refused to believe it, but Dane calmly stated it was the truth. Mogar's face twisted as if he were suffering severe constipation, and he barked that the boy was making it all up. At that point the Duke stepped in, suggesting they settle the matter with a direct test. Count Sogress turned to his son and asked if he was willing, and Dane agreed. Meanwhile, Mogar shot his own son a deadly glare for creating such a mess. The insolent boy looked terrified, knowing he was about to face his father's wrath, especially since he had no idea how to summon Genpu again. When he tried, he failed completely, prompting his father to shout at him as expected. Dane, on the other hand, only smiled, knowing he had already severed the original bond. There was no way Degron could summon Genpu back. Dane then offered to demonstrate by summoning Genpu himself, but added that he would need the summoning sigil that Degron held. The spoiled boy bristled, questioning Dane's audacity in demanding his sigil and spouting nonsense, but Count Sogress interrupted. He reminded Degron that, according to his own words, even if Dane used the sigil he should not be able to summon Genpu, so there was no harm in allowing the attempt. Mogar sweated harder, realizing he had no choice, and reluctantly told his son to hand it over. The red-haired boy was nearly in tears, but his father ordered him to hurry. As soon as Dane received the sigil, he began his spell. He explained that a summoning sigil carries a unique coded name of the summoner, which normally prevents anyone else from using it. However, since Genpu was already imbued with Dane's mana, the sigil was merely a vessel, and Genpu was now connected to him. When Dane called for Genpu, the creature appeared instantly and happily licked his cheeks. Both the Count and the Duke were amazed, while Mogar and Degron trembled, exposed as liars. The Duke found it incredible and wondered aloud whether Dane was also training in swordsmanship. His father confirmed it, though he admitted he was not entirely sure of the boy's full abilities. The fat noble, meanwhile, realized his plan had completely collapsed. The Count turned to him and asked if he now acknowledged that Dane had spoken the truth. The flustered man quickly tried to act calm, laughing and admitting that perhaps they had misunderstood and thought Dane had stolen the summon. He also claimed that his son had never intended to kill Dane, and he asked the boy to confirm it. Degron trembled but agreed, saying he only meant to scare Dane. Our young hero, however, burned with anger at how these scoundrels were trying to escape responsibility so easily. Before either of the High Lords could give their final judgment, a lady entered the scene, startling everyone, especially Dane, whose eyes widened when he saw Layla. As she approached, she declared that what Digran had said was not true. Her father quickly asked why she was there, and she replied that she had heard voices while taking a walk. Before continuing, she politely greeted the count and the fat noble. Magar stammered in surprise, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected encounter with the duke's daughter. Count Sogress went straight to the point, asking Layla about her claim that Digran was lying. She confidently confirmed it, saying she had indeed overheard their earlier conversation during her stroll. Digran began to panic, realizing she might have heard everything.